Back when I was a recent seminary graduate, a friend who was raised mostly secular with kind of some casual observance of Jewish holidays, but no Christian background, reached out to me with a quandary. She wanted to talk to her minister friend. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but the short version was that a mutual friend of ours had gotten very involved in a church which was noted for teaching and preaching ideas that my friend and I both found strongly objectionable, and based on everything we knew about this mutual friend, we would have thought that she would find strongly objectionable as well. My friend had approached this mutual friend to ask about it, and the friend had kind of dodged the question and said something about like living with cognitive dissonance and taking things on faith. And so my friend, my non-Christian friend, wrote to me and said, "Help me understand. How could someone seem to hold one set of values 6 days a week and then go to a church on Sunday that preaches different values entirely? How can this be?" I wrote back to her and I tried to offer what I could in terms of an explanation. And the way that I thought about it then, and I think still think about it now, is that there are ways of thinking within parts of Christianity where people really feel that what it means to be a Christian is to try to force yourself to believe things that your gut tells you are not correct, not true. That the work of faith is to believe in spite of yourself in a series of difficult to accept claims. Miracle stories, 7-day creation, doctrines and dogmas, and so on. And in this way of thinking, if that is what it means to be a Christian, any moment of doubting the truth of these things is sin and heresy and temptation. Our mutual friend was very much raised in that kind of church, where questions and doubts were seen as shameful and sinful. And I suggested to my friend that when you are raised with the idea that faithfulness is about suppressing your questions and your doubts, that teaches you to silence yourself and doubt yourself, to see your own moral compass as suspect. And so when you step into a church that teaches things that just don't sit right with you, and there were many things about this church that did not sit right with me. It was, for instance, it was one of the ones that teaches not only that women can't be preachers, but that in fact God's plan is for no woman to ever work outside the home, and that should only be done in cases of extreme financial hardship, right? Like these kinds of things. There were many things like this. When you step into a church that teaches things that just don't sit right with you, you've already learned to assume that the church is right and your gut is wrong, and that your work as a Christian, if you want to be righteous, is to squash your doubts and silence your critical thinking and toe the line. Today's text takes us into questions about faith and doubt, about seeing and believing, about the seeming impossibilities of the story of Jesus and the miracle of Easter. And for those of us who care a lot, and I think most of us do, about bringing our minds to church, that can be tricky. Today we heard the story of Thomas, who has been called Doubting Thomas, although that doesn't strike me as exactly fair. After all he asks for is the same opportunity that the other disciples had to see the risen Christ with his eyes. And in Luke, we hear that none of the disciples believed, the women who went to the tomb early that Easter morning and saw Jesus first. In Luke, we hear they, the women, told all this to the 11 and to all the rest, but these words seemed to them, to the disciples, an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So it's not really fair that the church has saddled Thomas with this label of Doubting Thomas, labeling him as the black sheep, the one with the weak faith, the skeptic. Our reading for today comes from the Gospel according to John, and it picks up right after where we left off on Easter. In fact, the first part of the reading takes place later in the day on Easter Sunday. The women have found the empty tomb, and now the text takes us to later that same evening with the disciples gathered in perhaps the very same room where they last ate with Jesus. Suddenly, standing inside that locked room with the disciples is the risen Christ. Standing among them, he shows them the wounds in his hand and his hands and his side. When the disciples tell Thomas what they've seen, he says, "Unless I see the marks of the nails in his hands, and put my fingers in the marks, and put my hand in the wound on his side, I will not believe." I think a lot of Christians can identify with Thomas, although we probably wouldn't want to put our hands in the wounds of Jesus. There are times, maybe a lot of times, maybe all the time, when the claims of faith are challenging to accept at face value. And all too often, churches have held that the work of being Christian is to push the questions to the side and to commit to accepting the miracle stories unquestioningly, as if we were willing the impossible into existence by believing hard enough. But Jesus is not Tinkerbell, and the resurrection does not require your belief. God cannot be hurt by your doubts or your questions, your uncertainty about what to do about miracle stories and the laws of science. We probably have different ways about thinking about those things here. And I believe that God's love is big enough for all of them, and that our righteousness is not contingent on suppressing our minds, our thoughts, our questions, our doubts. Lots of churches and sermons and Sunday school lessons condemn those kinds of questions and anyone who admits to asking them. But when we look at the Bible, Jesus doesn't. Jesus doesn't. He answers those questions. He says, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Don't doubt, but believe." He doesn't say squelch your questions. He responds to them and offers, in the middle of Thomas's doubt, an invitation to faith. Not a faith based on silencing one's inner voice, but a faith grounded in love, where Thomas doesn't have to choose between trusting himself and trusting God, but where he comes with his questions and eventually gets what he needs to bring the pieces together and wholeheartedly embrace and proclaim the Easter news. I don't know what happened with the mutual friend who was going to the church that seemed so out of alignment with her life and her values and mine as well. But my hope for her and for each of us, when we find that our own thoughts, our own internal compass, our own conscience is out of alignment with what we understand the teachings of the church, the big church, or this particular church, or wherever we find ourselves be. My hope is that we will keep asking, keep wondering, keep exploring, keep learning, keep searching. Maybe we will find that our perspective shifts. Maybe not. But I hope that none of us, none of you, ever feel that our religion requires us to silence our doubts and our questions in order to conform to the doctrines of the faith. After our hymn, we'll read together one of the ancient creeds of the church, the Apostles' Creed. And each section of that creed begins with the words, "I believe." Sometimes that's hard for people. I've heard that from people here. I've heard it from people in other churches. Sometimes it's hard to say those words, "I believe," and then say something that you're struggling with, that the church has taught, something that doesn't quite sit right, something that you don't quite understand, or that you think about a little differently, or that you wouldn't word that way if you were writing it from scratch. So I invite you, if there are sections of that creed that are hard for you, to reflect on how you want to engage with it. You can listen in silence to parts that you don't feel you can say with integrity. You can listen in silence to the whole thing, and that's okay. You can read it, including parts you know you don't agree with or don't understand, as a sign of participation in something bigger than any of us, that over the years has taught and developed and embraced these doctrines, even if you don't accept or understand all of them, and that's okay. You can read it with some skepticism in your voice. And this happens sometimes, especially in this church. I've heard it in other churches too. I love when this happens, when there's a really difficult Bible reading, one that's really troubling, and somebody has to come up and read it, and it's a really hard one. Maybe there's violence in it or difficult stuff. And the person gets to the end of it and they say, "This is the word of the Lord." And it's so authentic, and I love that, the commitment to connect with the words, with our questions and our doubts. And so you can read the Apostles' Creed, and if there is skepticism in your voice for parts, that is okay. The Greek word for believe and the related word for faith have a different sense than the English words, less about intellect, about thinking something is correct, and more about trust, living as though it is true. There are bridges that I've driven over that, frankly, I look at them and I think, how? That does not seem like that would work. I don't think that it looks like it would hold the weight of the cars driving over it. And yet, day after day, people drive their cars across the bridge. The sense of belief, as Jesus uses it, is not so much about looking at the bridge and thinking, yeah, that'll do. I see how it works. It's more about being willing to drive across the bridge anyway. I'm not always sure what to make of the story of the resurrected Christ as far as science goes. I value science and I love Jesus, and how I deal with those two things from an intellectual standpoint has changed over my life and probably will keep changing. But the belief Jesus invites us to isn't about forcing our thoughts into compliance with the doctrines of the church. It's about trust. I've found that I can trust in God, that I can rely on Jesus. Love may not always seem stronger than death, and I cannot explain to you the resurrection, but I found that the bridge will hold. The good news of the resurrection is not just for people who have their theological ducks in a row, for people who have answered all of their questions and dealt with all of their doubts. It's not just for people with both feet firmly planted in hope and rejoicing. It is for all of us. Those of us who don't quite believe all of it, don't quite understand it, can't quite accept it. When we are doubtful, when we are uncertain, when we can't quite accept or comprehend the good news, we are not condemned. We are invited. We are invited to bring our whole selves to church, to meet Christ, with all of our questions and our doubts and our wonderings. We are invited to the communion table, to meet God with our bodies, to taste and see that God is good. We are invited to gather with one another in loving community, to hear the stories and sing the songs that have carried the faith through the centuries, that proclaim hope and love and peace and justice. We are invited to go out into the world, to love and serve our brothers and sisters. We are invited to meet the risen Christ. Thanks be to God. Amen. Our hymn of response is "We Walk by Faith and Not by Sight," number 399.